This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
Now, Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? 2026, already hopping. So, Mark, what the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on is Donald Trump has overthrown Nicolas Maduro in the first days of 2026. Before we get, we're going to go do a deep dive on Venezuela. We've got a great guest, Roger Noriega, who's former ambassador to the OAS and former assistant secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, who's going to explain to us who the players are. If you don't know a lot about Venezuela, because I think a lot of us were taken by surprise by the sudden emergence of Venezuela as a front burner issue in American foreign policy, though it's been percolating there for a while. So Roger's going to give us a dive into explain Venezuela for idiots, which both Danny and I need. But I just want to go up a few 30,000 feet here for a second. This has been a really bad past year for the isolationist right. If in Trump's first term, if you think about this, he bombed Syria twice. He launched a cyber attack on Russia. He killed Qasem Soleimani. And the isolationists looked at that and they said, well, you know what? The problem is he's being manipulated by all these globalists he had to depend on in his first term. And so in the second term, we're going to get rid of all the globalists and we're going to staff it with the administration with people who are MAGA, right? And they're going to be complete hardliners and loyalists, and that'll solve the problem. Well, let's review what's happened in the first term. He bombed the Houthis. He bombed Iran. He bombed ISIS terrorists in Syria. He's bombed ISIS terrorists in Nigeria. Now he's bombed Venezuela and sent U.S. special forces in to capture Nicolas Maduro and bring him to New York on charges of drug trafficking. And he's also doing a lot more to help Ukraine on this than Joe Biden ever did. This is not the isolationist regime that some of these folks were dreaming of. In fact, I think that he's actually even more aggressive in flexing American military. That would have been a record. That would have been the equivalent of what he would have accomplished over 4 years in his first term. He's done that just in the first year of his presidency. I think it's great. I'm pretty happy with the Trump administration and President Donald Trump. And you know what? It turns out they all thought it was the globalists surrounding him. It turns out it was Trump all along.
That I agree with. Yes, it was Barzini all along, like the line from The Godfather. No, listen, I agree with that. I don't think Trump is an isolationist. I don't think Trump is the person that people like Tucker and others represented him to be.
Not only not just an isolationist, Danny, but I don't think that previous Republican presidents would have done some of the things that Trump has done, like bombing Iran's nuclear program, by going in and spending special operations forces to abduct Maduro. These are things that only Donald Trump would do. So kudos to him for that.
No, I agree with you about those things. I think, the thing, Mark, that I always worry about, and we'll talk about this after we air our interview, because I think really are going to want to hear what Roger has to say, because we address all of the questions that are floating out there about what's really going on behind the scenes, what are the real motivations. The thing that I always worry about with the Trump administration is that I think the president has very clear ideas about things. I don't think that they're amazing on execution. The one thing that gives me, the one thing that gives me cause for optimism in the case of Venezuela is that this is really an issue where Marco Rubio is in charge. And I think Marco Rubio cares a great deal about our neighborhood. I think Marco Rubio cares a great deal about the future of Venezuela and Cuba. And I don't think that he can allow this outcome to be Maduro in a skirt. I think he has to ensure that there is a better future that doesn't simply relate to coke trafficking and oil sales and cronyism with the Iranians, but relates actually to a better future for Venezuela, because that could potentially change all of South America. It really could roll the tide of red.
Bring down Cuban regime too.
Yep.
If we do it right.
Inshallah. Inshallah, as my Muslim friends say.
Wouldn't it, by the way, let me just say this, Trump's legacy, if you think about this, every president since John F. Kennedy has tried in some way or other to squeeze the Cuban regime, to bring the Castros down, to bring democracy to Cuba, to bring that regime down. Wouldn't it be amazing if Donald Trump was the one who did it through this action via Venezuela, which is cutting off all of their access to hard currency and oil? I think that would be one hell of a legacy. And then the other point, and we get into this a little in the discussion, but I want to highlight it at the front, is that there's a lack of appetite for putting American boots on the ground after the war on terror, right, around the world. Just like there was when Ronald Reagan came into the office after Vietnam, right? There's not an appetite for putting American boots on the ground. There's two ways you can respond to that and deal with that. One is to withdraw and start saying we have to be much more focused on America and not engaged in the world and not flexing a military muscle around, or you can do it a different way. And I think what Trump is doing is he is finding a way to flex American military muscle in the world without deploying American boots in the ground. We're not going to send American troops into Caracas to occupy the country and have a coalition provisional authority and impose the opposition and all the rest of that. What we're doing is we're using the power of the U.S. military to take out the regime and then coercing the interim leader through the threat of doing it again. And I think we need to show a little bit of forbearance to the administration in terms of how they carry this out, because they're trying to because the alternative is to just say, this is not our problem, we're just going to step back. And I think that what Trump is doing, he's doing good things on the world stage. He's trying to stop the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon. He's trying to protect Christians in Nigeria. He's trying to get rid of a regime in Venezuela that was a nexus of all the world's enemies in our hemisphere. These are good things, but we're going to do it without putting troops on the ground. And I think that's the right way to do it. And he's trying to create something different here that I think is positive.
On that extremely optimistic note, let us introduce, even though Mark already mostly did it, our really dear friend Roger Noriega. He's the founder and managing director of a consulting firm called Visión Américas, LLC. He has teams in Washington and in Bogota. He spent 10 years on Capitol Hill with yours truly in both cases, Mark and me. He was the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere. He was the ambassador to the OAS, and he has been a principled advocate for freedom in Central and South America all of his life.
Here's our interview. Roger, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. This is my third time. I even haven't cashed my first two checks yet.
Well, you're not getting that third one. Go. The third check will be as valuable as the first and second.
Can't wait.
Good. Well, anyway, we're glad to have you. So basically, we need a Venezuela for idiots here. For a lot of Americans, this has come out of nowhere. They really weren't focused on Venezuela. It became elevated when President Trump sent an armada to start taking out the gunboats and then blockading the oil. And then all of a sudden, we've swooped in and taken out their leader, Nicolas Maduro. I mean, just walk us through, why does Venezuela matter first? Let's start with that. Why is this important to us to have taken some action against the regime in Venezuela?
Well, Venezuela is, as someone described it to me, their take on it was Venezuela's California. It's literally twice the size of California, about the same population, beautiful coastline, extraordinary oil wealth, a democracy until it was mugged 25 years ago by Hugo Chavez, who was a strong man who managed to get himself elected president in 1998. And proceeded to dismantle the rule of law, the Constitution, and destroy the economy. A country that was producing $3.2 3.2 million barrels a day in oil in the year 2000 is producing not quite a million, and it actually dipped to roughly 500,000 barrels a day. So it destroyed the economy. And then since 2004, got whole hog into the cocaine business, being a neighbor with Colombia and wanting to do damage to the United States and to Colombia. Chavez authorized the involvement of his military in cocaine smuggling. And so from that point, this was a government that was totally involved, immersed in smuggling cocaine to the United States.
And then also, it's a regional hub now for all of America's enemies as well. They're basically replaced the Soviets as the subsidizer for the Cuban communist regime, right? They were bringing in the Russians and Chinese. Talk a little bit about the foreign influences in Venezuela and how it became this hub for America's enemies.
Absolutely. It's clearly the Russians looked at Venezuela, oil-rich country, as a market first and foremost for its arms. The Chinese wanted access to the oil and other resources. But to the extent we turned a blind eye to it, they got more and more involved in having a security presence. The Cubans, by the way, micromanaged the country from almost the beginning. They helped ensure Chavez's original election, and he was very popular. There was a discredited traditional political parties that lost legitimately in 1998. But the Cubans always had their eyes on Venezuela. It was the primary objective of Fidel Castro, getting to that oil wealth. That's the reason, by the way, they had such a close relationship with the United States, is precisely because we wanted to give them the wherewithal to defend themselves from a Cuban insurgency and protect the oil fields. So that relationship goes back a long while. Unfortunately, now you've got Iran with a presence there, training these famous colectivos to suppress uprisings or any kind of protests modeled on the besiege. The Chinese voracious appetite for oil, and now mostly want to be paid for the oil that have an oil debt, and so they're collecting on that. The Iranians and the Chinese and the narco traffickers from Colombia all have had a willing host in the Chavez-Maduro regime.
So, Roger, there are a lot of countries that have bad leaders, that repress their people, that cooperate with the Iranians or the Russians or the Chinese, who are, frankly, our adversaries on the global stage. And we are not moving to kidnap their leader
Not kidnap, Danny.
Well, yeah,
Use the
actually,
left language. Arrest, capture, detain. Even the BBC put out an advisory to his journalists that they can't say kidnap.
Okay. I won't use the English language then, because apparently the right is now also censoring me. To fly in and take by force the dictator of Venezuela. So why do we care? Why? And I think this is a really, really important question to explain to the American people.
Venezuela has been converted into a platform for our enemies in the hemisphere, projecting the Russian intelligence capabilities, Chinese involvement, the narco trafficking, the proceeds of which are used to undermine every democracy in the Western Hemisphere. They began using their oil wealth to undermine the consensus against corruption and terrorism and drug trafficking, and then converted where they actually got involved in those things. Furtherance of their drug trafficking, attacking the rule of law in countries throughout Central America, up through Mexico. A toxic, really pumping this venom throughout the Western Hemisphere. And it became a real threat to stability in the region.
Got it. And let's talk a little bit about I don't want to get into the politics, but I do want to talk about the opposition, because Venezuela does have an opposition movement. And I suspect, although I've never seen polls, I suspect that the Venezuelan people, who have been the first victims of this Chavismo for a quarter of a century now, taking the richest country in South America and turning it into a complete and total kleptocratic basket case. So they hate their leadership. They hate the regime. There was an opposition leader that the United States worked with very closely. Our friend Elliot Abrams was the special envoy for Venezuela in the first Trump term, and there was Juan Guaido. Tell us about the internal politics, about the elections, and about the opposition.
Well, an important point is that this regime has looted about $500 billion in oil revenue from the Venezuelan people and driven 8 million Venezuelans into exile.
Roger?
Yes.
Where is that money? Where is the money they've stolen?
Oh, it's in every bank in the world, including in the United States, and in assets. They operate. There's a network of bagmen, testaferros, cutouts that manage massive funds on behalf of members of the regime. And so they cut sweetheart deals for their own government. Delcy Rodriguez, for example, is directly involved, and she's the interim president now. She is directly involved in a program that received $400 million from government money to buy food for the people of Venezuela, and instead gave them putrid food, rotting food, and swindled these people out of these monies. And then they also got involved in sweetheart deals with government contracts and another $700 million. That's just Delcy. So it is a kleptocracy that's driven, again, 8 million people of decent, educated engineers into exile. And you have every Uber you get into in South America is probably driven by a Venezuelan heart surgeon or oil engineer. And so the opposition, unfortunately, and I hesitate to say this, by and large, is the best opposition money can buy. I refer to it as an officialist opposition that has an expertise in delivering synchronized concessions to the regime over the last 25 years. Taking a dive on winning elections and then taking a dive, not contesting the results in the streets. And part of it is, just cold-blooded threats against them and their wherewithal and their families. And then part of it is this kind of traditional clientelist mentality of Venezuelans, to where they've always depended on the largesse of the state. And so you have to play ball. That's the way it is. And Maria Corina Machado may be the only one who hasn't done that. And I remember a young opposition leader telling me, her problem is that she's not she's not corruptible. Her problem is she doesn't understand that everybody has a sponsor. Everybody's on the make here. And quite frankly, that's the reason she's the only one with any credibility. And it's the reason that up to now, we haven't been able to corner the regime. Because they use that largesse, by the way, to hire, or in my case, try to hire, every lobbyist in Washington, every law firm in Washington. If they want to launder money through a bank and the bank says, compliance officer says we can't do it, they buy the bank. That's what they can do, massive reach. And by the way, buying not just influence, but agents in the U.S. government. I have to say that a lot of what you see today and some of the decisions being made is the CIA that's been led around by the nose for most of the last 2 decades by people hired by the regime or who are part of the regime who are telling the agency what the regime wants them to think or what they want them to know. And they think that they've flipped these Chavista or Maduro regime representatives, and what's really happening is they're flipping the CIA and giving them bad information about how, I've seen this pattern repeated in Latin America. You guys have seen it in other parts of the world as well, where the best way to discredit an opposition leader is say, she's very radical. She's very complicated. She doesn't work well with others. And that's what they've laid down on Machado now. But unfortunately for them, she has massive support among the Venezuelan people.
Hey, Roger, just a quick follow-up. One of the comments that Elliot Abrams made in his first piece, and I'm reminded of it by a piece that you wrote, actually, criticizing John Bolton's book and first-term strategy. Elliot wrote that the intel community was completely hostile to the idea of working with any opposition and was completely hostile to, to pro-democracy forces in Venezuela. And you added in commentary on John Bolton's book when he wrote about Venezuela that they were everybody was completely naive. Talk a little bit about the sort of the institutionalized problems, not who, what, where, when inside the Trump administration, but the institutionalized problems of the U.S. dealing with Venezuela at this point.
Well, I have to say, before talking about the more conventional issues, I think there's a serious counterintelligence problem that we're facing in the United States, probably in the whole world, but definitely in Latin America. I myself know 3 people who have now been identified as Cuban spies. A reporter once asked me about Manuel Rocha, who was exposed as a Cuban spy, former ambassador to Argentina, and asked me what I thought of that. I said, I wouldn't have put him on my list of top 10 suspected spies. And by the way, I could make a list of top 10 suspected spies and people who have been bought off by these regimes. And so we have a serious counterintelligence problem. I'll start right there. The other thing is, when Chavez probably stole a plebiscite in 2004, and I was assistant secretary at the time, and we couldn't prove anything. I asked the CIA, tell me what's going on. How did they do this? How did they steal this? They didn't have the first idea, they claim. But I think, frankly, they knew what was going on, and that some of the technology that was being used in Venezuela to steal their election, we were more than aware of. I have a colleague, Gary Bernstein, who used to work at the CIA, who has said that, as a matter of fact, we're using some of that election technology in other parts of the world. And so we might very well have known what was going on. And that may be how Chavez kept himself in power. He invented this technology. By the way, who headed the company that did this? Jorge Rodriguez, Delcy's brother. And he headed the company that was created explicitly to steal elections. And so that's another reason why he's in control. I have to say, back to the first Trump administration and the Juan Guaido scenario, and to explain to folks what that was. We, the United States, were very proactive in supporting a constitutional succession and challenging the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro under the first Trump administration. And the solution was the installation of Juan Guaido, putatively the Democratic president of the National Assembly, who was elected to fill the vacancy, a de jure vacancy in the presidency. The problem is everybody around that strategy, I have heard, including Juan Guaido, including principals of his government who were going around the world saying we're the democratic elected, were actually working for the regime or receiving money by the regime. And so what that was a strategy. They saw President Trump coming in his first term. This guy's got the bit in his teeth. He's talking very aggressively against the regime. And so they fed this strategy to the first Trump diplomatic team so Trump would punch himself out trying to work with the strategy that they were feeding to the United States government. So we're super down in the weeds, but the point is we have been on the back foot vis-a-vis this regime for a good long while, precisely because the enemy's call is coming from inside the house, because they have used this massive resources to buy influence, to buy access, and unfortunately, it's a pattern that I hope isn't being repeated.
So your comment about the heart surgeon cab drivers all across Latin America or Venezuelan struck me, because when you and I were in Cuba together, I remember the joke in Havana was, "Oh, my son, he's a doctor, but he wants to be a cab driver. He has delusions of grandeur."
Yeah, exactly.
But what it's telling about that is that it's a socialist regime, but the regime itself is narco-capitalist, right? They are not socialist. They are actually very capitalistic when it comes to the drug trade. And one of the reasons why the Trump administration has said that they went and got Maduro is because he was the head of a cartel. So talk to us a little bit about Maduro and his connection to the drug trade, his corruption, and why is there a case against him? Is this case in federal court going to succeed, and against his wife too?
The indictment that they unsealed with his arrest or arraignment a couple of days ago is the third iteration of the indictment against Maduro and members of his immediate family, as well as against the defense minister who's still in power, and Diosdado Cabello, another henchman of the regime who's still in power. These folks, generally because of their nexus to the military and the control of the military, became directly involved in aiding and abetting the movement of drugs through Venezuela to the coast, to markets in the United States and Europe. So the government was directly involved in that. At a certain point, very early on, PDVSA, the state-run oil company, was actually paying the narco traffickers from Colombia for cocaine, paying in cash, so that the guerrillas in Colombia could wage their war against Colombia's democratic government. So here you have an state-run oil company directly involved in narco trafficking, and it has become worse over the years. Because they had to get rid of the cocaine. So all of a sudden, we're in the cocaine business. One of the key witnesses against Maduro, who's in the United States, well, actually there are two that are in the United States right now that can point to Maduro's involvement in the narco trafficking, into the government's. This is basically a continuing criminal enterprise. The government's direct involvement in shipping drugs, and laundering money, and promoting those who were involved in trafficking and attacking and killing or sidelining people who resisted. This has basically been a country this is basically a cartel with a government on the side. And people will say to me, "Why, Roger? Why do they need cocaine? They have oil." Well, because they want more, and because cocaine is a sustaining enterprise, is a self-sustaining enterprise, and oil is hard to get out of the ground, particularly that thick oil in Venezuela. It's complicated, and you need rules, and you need companies, and you need banks, and you need cash and capital to get the oil out of the ground. To move cocaine, all you need is gasoline and boats and military trucks and military aircraft and a complicit government, and that's what they have, and it's basically a cartel with running a government and an oil company on the side.
So, Roger, you have talked and alluded to Delcy Rodriguez, who was Maduro's vice president. I've gotten into the habit over the last few days of calling her Maduro in a skirt. But do a bit of a dive for our listeners about who she is, and then let's talk a little bit about the suggestion that is being made, although this is certainly not confirmed, that she has been negotiating with the United States for quite a long time after Maduro refused to capitulate to the demands of the Trump administration.
Well, Delcy Rodriguez and her brother Jorge Rodriguez are the son of a famous leftist guerrilla, but with money. So they're actually educated in France. So they're sophisticated folks. They returned to Venezuela and became part of Chavez's government from the very beginning, or very early on. Sophisticated, intelligent people. She served in various positions, including as foreign minister. She's credited with helping get the country's economy off its back and performing to a certain extent with some sort of predictability and delivering goods. And so she's a woman of some capability, educated, but a survivor and a co-conspirator in this regime. And I already explained where she herself was involved in crooked deals, almost $1 billion. She and her domestic partner. Her brother is the president of the National Assembly. So these are founding fathers of the Bolivarian narco regime, and they've been waiting for their opportunity to come up. Now the fact is, I'm aware. I'm not in the government. But I have a lot of good contacts both in Venezuela and here, and virtually all of these henchmen have been reaching out to Washington for the better part of since President Trump was elected to try to cut a deal. And by the way, they all have advocates, and they're willing to pay top dollar for these lobbyists. And I can't say explicitly who they are, but I know that they circle. And Maduro himself had a call with President Trump. And the call was arranged, strangely enough, by a billionaire from Brazil. And so that call happened, and some context with his administration. But Maduro said, I want to leave power on a plane, go into exile, and I want you to drop the indictment against me, and I want to be able to take my money. And to his credit, President Trump would never bid on dropping the charges. But Delcy Rodriguez, I think it's pretty apparent, gave up Maduro.
Ooh.
Surrender, absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. Surrendered Maduro.
Well, they say now. So all the news accounts say that they had a source inside in Maduro's inner circle,
right,
who gave them information about his whereabouts and how his.
Absolutely.
You think that was her?
It may have been. It may have been actually even Cuban agents, because for 25 years the internal security for the presidents Chavez and now Maduro have been Cubans. They don't even trust the Venezuelans. So Delcy would have had some access, and she also would have been able to cut deals or know who the head of Maduro's security was, know certain things about him. So I think it's pretty clear to me, at least as an observer, that Delcy gave him up. And what's fascinating is that Diosdado Cabello is another henchman, and Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who's, by the way, Russia's guy there, is the defense minister.
I love all these Latin Americans named Vladimir.
Yeah. There's a baseball player named Vladimir Guerrero. I'll have to talk to you about that later, but he and his son. In any case, did the defense minister, did this other henchman Cabello know that we're giving up Maduro? I think it's a question. And if they didn't, well, they're not convinced of that, and they see that Delcy gave him up, because let's face it, she's the person that the United States is dealing with now. Is she going to come after them, or are they going to strike? Right? They're going to strike before she can. So the point is, anybody with any sense, in my opinion, should be planning their exit strategy. Any of these regime leaders should be planning their exit strategy, and that, to me, would be a hopeful sign. The longer Delcy Rodriguez is able to sustain herself in power, the worse it is for the Venezuelan people, and frankly, the worse it is for us. Because God forbid we get to that point where we come to see, well, the stability of Delcy Rodriguez is preferable to chaos. No, my friends, that would be a disaster for us. The United States cannot make common cause with that regime, and because that would be, it's absolutely unsustainable. You'll never get the economy off its back without the rule of law and a stable, popular government. And my hope is that a guy like Rubio, who's managing this thing day to day, recognizes that and will see the natural role, if not for Maria Corina specifically, then at least someone who's that answers to the Venezuelan people.
So, Roger, let's talk about let's talk about the politics here. So there are two potential sides of this. I think a lot of us were surprised when the Trump administration and when Rubio himself, I don't want to say he badmouthed, but he expressed very little confidence in Maria Corina Machado. And again, I don't know her. You are the expert here. You know these people. There is no question, and we talked about this, all of us, our little family over text, you, me, Mark, and others. I have experienced working with a lot of opposition movements over the last 40 years. I have experienced this problem of a very charismatic individual who is a very good spokesperson for an opposition government to a totalitarian regime, but who really does not know herself, himself, how to actually execute, how to run government, or how to delegate power. And we saw this, for example, in spades in Burma, for example. Aung San Suu Kyi had this problem. So talk a little bit about how you see the Maria Corina Machado question, and if you think she is the only one, and you suggested that you did, then how we get from here to there.
Mm-hmm. Well, by the way, she's a brilliant woman, courageous and brilliant. She's an engineer. I worked with her on and off for 25 years. She's steadfast. She's trusted. She's very capable. The problem is she's up against a regime that involves, it's backed up and organized by ruthless Cubans, bloodthirsty Iranians, Russians, Chinese, and the fact that she's not able to serve up a plan as a person who's basically living in hiding in Caracas, Venezuela, the fact that she wasn't able to give the United States a convincing plan on how she's going to take over this toxic waste dump of a government, I don't think disqualifies her. I don't think that we have much of a plan, quite frankly, until now. And so I will say this. The president took this risk. It's absolutely, totally within his right to say who's going to run things and what we're going to do now. He also made a rational decision, a completely rational decision, that he didn't want to put the forces on the ground in Caracas needed to police the country, let alone impose a new government. So they've been forced into this unconventional set of choices. It doesn't have to be worked out now. I'll tell you, 2 months ago, I said to Maria Corina, we were having a Zoom call, and I said, the problem, Maria, is you have to make it clear to the government, our government, that they're not going to be stuck holding the bag, that they're not going to have to run everything, that you have the capacity to put together a team that can take responsibility for and effectively run the country, run a transition. Because right now the talk is they're talking about putting Delcy Rodriguez in. Yes, I heard this 2 months ago. And this would be a catastrophe for the country. And I told her this, you're not even in the room. And she said, Roger, I'm not worried about that. She said the day that Nicolas Maduro is removed from power will be the best day for every Venezuelan in the last 25 years. So that's the first step. The rest of it, I'm not worried about, because the Venezuelan people will not accept, and she was probably adopting my word, a soft landing for the regime. And we'll get to that, and I'll worry about that then. So to a certain extent, that's a rational reaction. She's not going to be able to run the government. She can't run the military. The military, they're not motivated by the same things that our military or even any other third world military. They're motivated by criminality and survival and getting access to money. And if they have to crack skulls to do that today, they'll do that. If they have to move gold out of the jungles, and they'll do that tomorrow. If they have to traffic with the cocaine, they'll do that. This is not a normal military that responds to a chain of command, and so she was never going to be able to figure that out. One final point. Is it better for Maria Corina Machado to be put in power or seen to be empowered by the U.S. government, and specifically the Trump administration? Or is it better for her to compete and win power in an election organized in the next several months, or 6 or 8 months, and assume power based on a popular vote of the Venezuelan people. I think the choice is pretty obvious. The crux of this is that where we're headed? And I have a lot of confidence in Secretary Rubio, who seems to be in the driver's seat. He may not have mapped out this particular route, but he's in the driver's seat now. And, for example, are we even talking with Delcy Rodriguez and the other henchmen and the other security forces about the need to organize elections or have a transition to democracy? And what are we talking to them about? Repression. So, because eventually we're going to discover that a Venezuelan regime that isn't allowed to move cocaine with impunity is not going to be generating oil revenue in any significant way for years, if not ever. That's not going to have resources to deliver food or health care or keep the lights on. And that's when the Venezuelan people are going to say, enough is enough. Delcy can't do it. She's not interested in doing it. This is more repression. This is a feature, not a bug of this regime. And God help the United States if we're saying be patient or, well, this is the way it's going to be. Because the Venezuelan people, I think, eventually will have their say. And it's going to be on the streets. And I think if I know that, or I suspect that, I'm sure Secretary Rubio does too, and he's prepared for that eventuality and wants to recognize that will recognize that you have to have a democratically elected president.
I love that assessment, and I think it's absolutely 100% correct. You know, one of the paradigms we're dealing with right now is that we have a president who is really exercising U.S. military might on the world stage in a way that a lot of people didn't expect him to in his second term, but is also not engaged in the kind of on-the-ground democracy building that previous administrations were engaged in. And so, for example, we knock out the Iranian nuclear program, and we basically explicitly reject the Pottery Barn rule, which is if you break it, you own it, right? No, we don't own it. We knocked it out, and if they rebuild it again, well, we can knock it out again. And what he said in the case of Venezuela is, well, we've taken out Maduro, and if Delcy doesn't do what we want her to do, she'll suffer the same fate or worse than Maduro, is what Trump has said. So we're sort of taking, and so in some ways that we have the coercive power because of the strength of the U.S. military to make them do things we want them to do or face consequences, but we're also constrained by the fact that we're not going to put boots on the ground and we're not going to occupy Caracas. We're not going to send Bremer over to run a coalition provisional authority and de-Ba'athify,
Thank God for that.
The regime there. So this is sort of new territory for the United States, where there's a lot of people, and I'm sort of, I appreciate the forbearance you're showing the administration and how they're doing it, because it's uncharted waters, because they're trying to do the alternative. And so a lot of people on the right have criticized Trump for being too focused on foreign policy. They didn't want him to bomb Iran. They didn't want him to bomb Nigeria. They didn't want him to bomb Caracas and seize Maduro. I'm glad he's doing all those things. And so the alternative is not that we would go in and do it, the old-fashioned way. The alternative is we wouldn't do anything at all. And so we've got to figure this thing out in a way that we can flex American military might in advance of American interests without the boots on the ground part. How do you see that playing out here?
How it plays out, I think, is the president says he's interested in oil. I wonder how much of that is just him placating his base, because he has to understand that it took Chevron and some other companies 5 years, granted with one arm tied behind their back, to get oil production from 500,000 barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day. 5 years. But 25 years ago, as I said, it was 3.2 million. You are not going to have the capital available into that country now under the current conditions. No serious private capital.
Nobody's going to invest, right?
Right. And by the way, it's an extraordinarily costly play, because the production costs of getting that high sulfurous, thick Venezuelan crude out of the ground is prohibitive. We're talking $30 a barrel, perhaps. I've seen higher numbers. And so they may have 303 billion barrels of oil underground, but it costs a lot of money to get it out. And it's just not cost productive. And we don't need the oil. There's an oil glut right now, as a matter of fact. So, but for the president to sustain the argument that we're due for the oil, they're going to soon recognize that you can't do that unless there's the rule of law in the country that will safeguard contracts, that will make it safe for oil engineers to go out and reactivate some of these fields. And that takes a lot of time, it takes people, and no one's going to put their capital into a country where the National Assembly basically doesn't exist, where the president is an illegitimate vice president who's now succeeded and is a acting president of questionable of legitimacy. So that's not going to happen. So I think it's going to be the imperative, an economic imperative that says the rule of law, representative democracy have to be part of this solution. And you can gradually start to work that into the conversation. But they can't wait forever. And they're at least they need to be prepared to deal with this and deal with members of the security forces. If the Venezuelan people rise up because the lights are off or there's no food and there's shortages, and then they start to blame not just Delcy but us, and they come out to the streets, that's when you're going to see the fissures where you'll see legitimate security forces say, we're standing with the people. And that's when you get the basis of people, core of people that can accompany the establishment of democracy and the installation and effective management of a new government. And that takes time. But we're not going to get there if we don't put that plan on the table. I have confidence in Rubio, and I hope that they're factoring this into their thinking.
Oh, I hope so too. And I do think, I do think Rubio is playing this shrewdly. So I have two exit questions, and one of them is for our listeners in particular. I want them to hear from someone who is really immersed in the details of this and in the behind-the-scenes machinations that are going on with the Venezuelan community. Okay, there are people. The president himself has also insinuated, this is for the oil. Right? The president has also said this is for the future, this is for the democracy, but he's also said this is for the oil. Talk about whether there are interests in the asphalt business, let's say, in the petroleum derivative business, who are a part of this calculus, and finally, give us your sense of why it is that, all of this swirling conspiracy theorizing is relevant or irrelevant to how Rubio pushes through this end game to get where we need to be.
Mm-hmm. So, as I said cryptically, Rubio didn't maybe not map out this route, but he's in the driver's seat. And I think he has a different outlook. It's not just all sort of a transaction. And I think he realizes the only sustainable solution is one that's going to be based on popular will and the Venezuelan people. This is not Libya, by the way. These are people who grew up with Western values and in a democratic culture until it was hijacked by these rotten people in the regime. And he knows this, and he knows they can manage these things, and we need to be in their corner. And he understands that this is, in the long run, the only way to produce results in the short run. We're in an election year too, in the United States, and I have to be hopeful about this because I have so many Venezuelan friends and care so much about it. But it's not just sentimentality. Rubio could produce a real political win here if he has a democracy on course to establish not just some toxic situation, but a country that's at least on a track to being a normal democratic country. Yes, with the oil wealth. Yes, with the human resources, to be a permanent free market partner with the United States. Venezuelan people who have learned the hard way that socialism doesn't work and who are real allies with the United States, and they'll go to their grave thanking us for what we did. We can do that, but we have to start turning the battleship, no pun intended, and be more like an aircraft carrier. We have to start turning the aircraft carrier now to where it's not all about like how do we reactivate the oil wealth and get the oil, but how do we stand with people to produce a permanent solution and a permanent alliance for the United States and South America. And by doing that, I think President Trump is in a position to run the table in South America. We've already got Chile, already got Ecuador, we already have Honduras. These are just recent elections. We have the Argentines there, the Dominicans are there as good friends. You could line up, Colombia is going to be tricky, but if you do the right things in the short run, it influences things in a positive direction. And Brazil, for that matter, which all of these countries that I mentioned have had recently or will have elections. And the president, we can really establish something significant, and that is a real legacy. And Rubio certainly recognizes that, and it won't take very much to explain that to President Trump either.
So I got two exit questions, but I'm going to ask my second one first because of what you just said. So there's a poll that just came out about net approval of the detention of Nicolas Maduro by the U.S. in Latin America. Costa Rica, plus 80. Colombia, plus 67. Peru, plus 63. Chile, plus 62. Panama, plus 59. Argentina, plus 30. Ecuador, plus 24. Uruguay, plus 19. Mexico, even, plus 1. And then you go to some of the other countries where what do you make of that?
So those are the net numbers, and I'm glad you brought that up.
The net positive,
which is extraordinary, and I'm glad you brought it up because you know what? I mentioned the Uber drivers, and I'm not laughing about these folks. These are decent people, incredibly decent people. You guys know, you probably run across these folks. And the Chileans know that, and the Peruvians know that, and the Colombians know that, and the Uruguayans and the Argentines know this. And they've all heard the stories of how they've been thrown out of their country. And they've been thrown out by these rotten criminals. And so, frankly, that's another thing, Mark. Just, if the president can deliver this as a real win, and they really, frankly, they have to stop with the rhetoric about oil, because it's not about that. They have to stop with the rhetoric about how we're running the country, because it's not about that either. Just delivering a genuine transition to democracy would be a huge legacy, a positive legacy, and put the United States on the right side of history. I hate to use that expression, but at least, delivering for the good people of Venezuela.
Okay, and then my final exit question: what's the Cuban play here? So this is an existential threat to the Cuban regime because, as you and I both know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost their subsidies from Moscow, so they went to the Europeans to try and get them to bail them out with hard currency by selling expropriated properties, a problem that you helped take care of, and shut that off with the Helms-Burton bill when we all worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then they went to Venezuela. And Venezuela has been giving them oil, and Venezuela has basically the only reason the Cuban economy is afloat right now is because of Venezuela, and they've lost that. They've lost that. Even before this, the Trump administration was interdicting ships with oil headed for Cuba. What does Cuba do inside Venezuela to try and impact this? And is this an existential threat to the Cuban regime?
Absolutely. And the Cubans are, as I said, have been micromanaging Venezuela for the better part of 25 years. They groomed Maduro since he was a teenager visiting Havana. They installed Maduro as Chavez's vice president. They handpicked him because they knew that he would be most loyal to the regime in Cuba and would keep the oil moving down. They handpicked him. They even engineered the transition because Chavez was probably dead when he won his last election. And they had to pretend that he was still alive so they could swear him in, not because of him, but because of his vice president, Maduro. So that's how Maduro backed into the presidency from the very beginning. And the Cubans micromanaged all that. I like to say that the biggest accomplishment of the vaunted Cuban health system is that it killed Chavez, right? and they treated him
So
there.
true.
And by the way,
So true.
whatever body they turned over to be buried, that is no longer, that was recently cremated, I guess. That was all literally micromanaged by the Cubans, and so they're
We
in
should send Bernie Sanders to have his health care down in Cuba and Venezuela.
they're
Outcomes, people. Outcomes.
they're in the fight of their lives, the Cuban regime, and Havana knows that. But let me say something. They know us better than we know us. They've been studying us because it's literally a question of live or die, life or death for them. And so they know exactly how Washington thinks and operates. But one of the biggest concerns they that they must have is that Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State, and one of the most powerful members of Congress in the House is Mario Diaz-Balart. And you saw, what was Mario Diaz-Balart, a Cuban-American, saying the other day? Maria Corina Machado will be the winner of the next election in Venezuela, without a doubt. And so that fierce commitment, which is a bipartisan commitment to Machado, is going to make a difference here too, because they're going to continue to remind the Trump administration, we have a solution here. We have the moral high ground. We have a Nobel Prize winner who fought and won a 67 to 30 something victory in an election. We need to play that card, because it shuts the European Union up. It shuts a lot of people up when they say, who are we putting in power? We're putting in power a Nobel laureate who won an election. And that's, it mystifies me that we set aside that card. But I don't think it's going to be for long. And I think the folks that want to see this change continue to Cuba are going to be right there advocating for a meaningful, effective, sustainable, irreversible transition in Venezuela.
But just to follow up, does Cuba fall? Does the regime fall as a result of this?
This is an interesting question, because we've all been saying the regime's going to fall for most of the last 30 years. But let me just put it this way. I believe that you may actually see unrest begin in Cuba, which is to say very soon, before you see it in Venezuela. Because they are already not getting the oil. It's already cut off. It's been cut off since President Trump was elected. And I'm sure we're being super fastidious about that now. And so that regime is dead men walking. They're very clever, and they probably had a role in a scenario that has Delcy Rodriguez as the interim president of the country. But it's just a matter of time before she's thrown overboard. And when that happens, we need to start looking at Cuba at what does a transition look like there.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, Roger.
What a great problem to have.
What a great thing it would be if on Trump's watch both Venezuela and Cuba made the transition to democracy and those regimes both finally fell.
That's a legacy. It's an absolute legacy. As I said to a Cuban American friend of mine today, Marco Rubio probably thinks, my mother met my father, so I could do this. And let's face it. That's why we have confidence in turning this thing in the right direction.
Well, you've made me more optimistic than I was before we talked, Roger. Thank you for this, and thank you for the work you're doing. Yeah, and thank you for the work that you're doing on this. One of the things I love about my former AEI colleagues, my former Senate Foreign Relations Committee colleagues, and my dear friends is we don't just talk about the need to do the right thing. We work really hard to ensure that it happens. It would be an incredible thing, and an incredible thing for Venezuela, but also a great legacy for Helms Burton and all of the people who worked on that law these many years ago, to see these enemy regimes, just on our shoreline fall.
I have a sister who has been threatening to buy me a red baseball cap that says Trump was right about one thing.
Let's hope he was.
Cut that. Thank you very
I
much.
think we're going to keep that, Roger.
We're
Appreciate it.
keeping it, Roger. Take care. Hey, Roger, thank you, really. This was
That was
great.
awesome.
God bless, guys.
So, Danny, what do you think?
So I want to talk a little bit about Marco Rubio because I'm in the strange new respect category. I didn't love him when he was on Capitol Hill because I didn't think that he spent enough time following up. He spent a lot of time talking, writing op-eds, introducing legislation that didn't go anywhere, although Stephen and I argue about this all the time, because he did introduce the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, which has been really important and did come into law. But, on other things, he did a lot of talking. I gotta say, I have been very impressed with the way that he keeps his powder dry. Eli Lake, our friend from the Free Press, wrote a piece about how Marco Rubio executed this Venezuela coup, and I thought it was very interesting. He doesn't leak, he doesn't seek to undermine the president. He recognizes that J.D. Vance and he do not agree, and we should talk about where J.D. Vance was when these decisions were made, Mark. But rather than taking on J.D. Vance either, quietly behind the scenes or publicly, he has kind of brought J.D. Vance into the tent and made him his best friend, and said that if J.D. runs, I'm going to be the first person to endorse him. He's a shrewd little Marco.
He is, and also Trump loves him. And Trump really not only respects him, but enjoys his company, which is really, really important. They talk football. He likes his sense of humor. I think the fact that Marco Rubio has more jobs than any person in the history of government. He's the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the head of the Agency for National Development, the head of the GAO, and now the Viceroy of Venezuela on top of everything else. It's now become an internet meme. Rubio, the picture of Rubio Rubio realizing he's about to become the president of Venezuela. Rubio recognizing that he's about to become the president of Cuba. He's managed this transition well. And, I think also he realizes that Trump's view is much more aligned with his than people think on foreign policy. And I think that that's important. It's an interesting phenomenon because there was a New York Times story the other day laying out the backstory of how all this played out and how all the debates and Rick Grinnell going to Caracas and all the engagements and everything like that. And if you search the story, the name Vance doesn't appear once. Isn't that? And it's just fascinating. And it's interesting. I don't know where. I'm pretty certain that if J.D. Vance were president, we probably wouldn't have done this. But there's a real. We're right now in a period where Donald Trump is really asserting his dominance of the world stage in a way that no president has done in a long time. Rubio is his right-hand man in this. And J.D. Vance, if he becomes the successor, would take the Republican Party and the country in a very different direction. And I don't know if he's biding his time and just letting this play out, or what's going on, or if he's learning and watching and being persuaded. I just don't know. But it's fascinating because Rubio and Vance have become very good friends, I think legitimately good friends, but they represent two very different points of view when it comes to what the future of the Republican Party's foreign policy. And that's also, by the way, why it's so important that this is successful. Because
totally agree with that.
If this is successful and all of these things that Trump is doing are successful, it solidifies a new era of conservative international leadership and a new model for conservative leadership on the world stage that pushes the isolationists off to the side. And if it fails, then they will be emboldened against it. So the stakes in this are not just high for Venezuela. They're not just high for the hemisphere. Literally, the future of conservative foreign policy hangs in the balance here, in not just in Venezuela, but in what's happening in Cuba, what's happening in Nigeria, what's happening in Iran and the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine. All of these things that Trump is doing We should be, all of us who are conservative internationalists should be rooting for him to succeed, because the alternative is that the isolationists look and say, see, Donald Trump, tried to new form of leadership on the world stage and it didn't work, and we've just got to pull back. And we don't want that to happen, because the world will be a worse place if it does.
Mark, I don't know what you did over the break, but whatever you did, maybe it was drinking Guinness Stout. Keep doing it. You sound uniquely smart. Well said.
You've known me so long and that you're shocked.
Hey, Happy New Year to you and yours. Happy New Year to all of our listeners. And yeah, hopefully it'll be a Happy New Year. Happy 250 to America.
Amen.
On Twitter, I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.